There is a note in Bloodborne, a single line of text tucked into the opening moments of the game, delivered before you understand what anything means or where you are or who you have chosen to be. It tells you to seek pale blood to transcend the hunt. You write it down, maybe. You search for it as you play, keeping that phrase in the back of your mind, expecting the game to eventually explain itself the way games usually do: an NPC revelation, a cutscene, a scroll of text that lays it all out. You play through the entire game. You fight through the streets of Yharnam. You descend into the Chalice dungeons. You find Murgo and Rom and the nightmare of Mensis and the doll who prays for you. You reach the ending, and pale blood is never explained. Not once. Not by anyone. Not anywhere. That note is Bloodborne's way of introducing itself. Not with a tutorial, not with a map, not with a handshake and a tour, but with a mystery it has absolutely no intention of resolving for you. And pale blood is just the beginning. Because behind every altar, every item description, there are questions that the game plants deliberately and answers only in fragments, in implications, in accumulations of detail that you have to assemble yourself at 3 a.m. with the lights off and your mind running faster than it should be running at this hour. Tonight we're going to sit with those questions, all of them. So settle in. There's no rush here. Let the questions come one by one, and let the answers settle like dust in a quiet room, like the sound of rain on an old roof, like the moment before sleep when the thoughts start to lose their edges. Bloodborne was released in 2015, and in the years since, its community has done something remarkable. They have treated the game's lore not as background, not as something to skip through to get to the next boss, but as a puzzle worth solving, worth caring about, worth spending real time and real intellectual energy on. They have cross-referenced item descriptions and Chalice dungeon text. They have translated the original Japanese to catch nuances that localization obscured. They have consulted Miyazaki interviews and dug through unused files and built wikis of extraordinary depth and detail. And yet the questions remain. That's not a failure of the community. That's a testament to how carefully the game was designed. Hidetaka Miyazaki has said in multiple interviews that he writes lore intentionally incomplete, that he wants players to fill in the gaps with their own imagination, that a story fully explained loses something essential that cannot be recovered. He has said that FromSoftware's games are built around the idea that mystery is not a problem to be solved, but a quality to be experienced. That not knowing, sustained at the right pitch and in the right conditions, can feel more like truth than any explanation. And nowhere in the FromSoftware catalogue is that philosophy more evident than in Bloodborne, where the horror is not just in the monsters but in the not knowing, in the sense that this world has a logic you can feel operating around and beneath you, a structure you can almost perceive, but that stays just at the edge of what your senses and your reasoning can reach. It is designed to produce the cognitive experience of encountering something that is genuinely beyond you, to simulate through careful absence what it would actually feel like to be a human being up against a great one. Tonight's video is organised around the 4 great categories of Bloodborne's mysteries. We begin with the hunters, with pale blood and the player character, and the hunter's dream, and the figures who defined it. Then we move to the institutions that tore Yharnam apart from the inside: Byrgenwerth, the healing church, the choir. Then we descend into the nightmares: Mensis, Micolash, the school's impossible and catastrophic reaching. And finally we walk through the DLC, through the old hunter's nightmare and the fishing hamlet, and the questions that the base game planted and left for the expansion to tend. By the end of this, you will not have every answer. That is not a promise the lore can keep, and I wouldn't want to make it. But you will have the best answers available, the strongest readings, the most evidenced interpretations, the theories that hold up under pressure, and perhaps more importantly, you will understand why the remaining mysteries feel the way they do, why they sit in the chest with a specific gravity, why you keep coming back to them. Let's begin. Let's start with the oldest question in Bloodborne's community. The one that launched more forum threads and Reddit posts and wiki debates than perhaps any other mystery in the game. The one that the game places in your hands in its very first moments and then systematically refuses to address. What is Paleblood? The note in the opening, left for you by a hunter whose name and face you never learn, in circumstances the game doesn't bother to explain, tells you to seek pale blood to transcend the hunt, and the word pale blood appears exactly one more time in the entire game. In the description of a depth 5 chalice dungeon called Thyr's Gravestone, the text describes the Great Ones as beings of pale countenance and pale blood. That's it. 2 uses, 1 instruction, 1 description. And from those 2 data points, the Bloodborne community has constructed an entire cosmological theory. The most supported reading, the one that most serious lore scholars converge on, is that pale blood is not a substance. It is not a bottle of something you find in a chest. It is not a serum or a blood type or a collectible item with a glowing outline. It is a descriptor, a quality. It describes a category of blood, the blood that belongs to or derives from the Great Ones themselves. In Bloodborne's world, blood is the organizing principle of everything. The Healing Church built a religion out of it. Byrgenwerth understood it as the mechanism of cosmic access. The beasts of Yharnam were created by it, and at the very top of the hierarchy, above human blood, above the bestial blood of the transformed, above even the blood of those who have partially ascended into something the game calls the kin, is the blood of the Great Ones. It is described as pale, colourless, thin as water to the naked eye, but carrying within it something that ordinary matter doesn't carry. The accumulated experience, the cognitive capacity, the dimensional reach of beings who exist partly in our world and partly in something else entirely. Pale blood is the blood of a god. To seek pale blood to transcend the hunt is to seek a connection so profound, so elevated above the merely human, that the cycle of the hunt can no longer hold you. The hunt is a human institution, built by Gehrman, sustained by blood ministration, trapped in a night that keeps repeating, that has its own logic and its own rules. To transcend the hunt means to step outside those rules entirely, to become something that the hunt's architecture wasn't designed to contain. This connects with beautiful precision to the true ending of the game. If you accumulate enough insight, enough real exposure to the truths the Great Ones carry, and if you consume 3 umbilical cords, the physical remnants of connections between humans and Great Ones, you absorb enough of that pale divine blood to do something no previous hunter has managed. You resist the moon presence, not just survive it, resist it, back against it, refuse the ending it was planning to give you. and what follows is transformation. The doll cradles your changed form, small, fragile, new, and speaks to you as though you are something she has to be gentle with. You have become something that the hunt cannot claim, because you have become something that is no longer entirely of the world the hunt was designed for. You transcended the hunt. The note was a mission statement, not a riddle. It told you exactly what the game was about. There is a second reading, darker and more personal, that some scholars prefer and that sits alongside the first without quite replacing it. In this interpretation, pale blood refers not to what you seek, but to what you already are. You arrive in Yharnam different from other travellers in ways the game hints at but never explains. Gehrman is waiting for you in the hunter's dream before you've done anything to earn his attention. The moon presence takes a specific and deliberate interest in you among all the hunters who have passed through. Something about your blood was already unusual, already pale, already closer to the Great Ones than any ordinary citizen of any ordinary city. In this reading, you were never searching for pale blood. You were always it. The note left by the unnamed hunter may have been a recognition rather than an instruction. Someone who encountered you or your blood before you arrived in Yharnam, who understood what you were and what you needed to do, who left that note as a kind of map. Not a treasure map, a map of identity. These two interpretations don't have to fight each other. You may have been drawn to Yharnam specifically because of what you already were, because the pale quality of your blood made you the right instrument for what the moon presence and perhaps other forces had been arranging. And the transcendence you seek may have always been latent in you, requiring only the events of one long night to activate it. There is a third reading of pale blood that deserves space here, one that engages with the mechanics of the game more directly. In Bloodborne, blood is described in tiers. The blood you receive from enemies is called blood echoes, the residue of their experience, the compressed weight of the lives they led and the deaths they died. This blood feeds your growth, converts into your strength and skill and endurance. It is functional but ordinary. It is the currency of the hunt. Above this is the blood that the healing church administers, old blood, the blood that derives from contact with the Thumerian ruins and the divine biology found there. This blood changes people. It heals things that shouldn't heal. It opens perception in ways that the blood of ordinary humans does not. It is also the blood that creates beasts when distributed without care, or in bodies that cannot tolerate its transformative pressure. Above this is the blood of the kin, the beings that have partially crossed into the Great One's register, who have ascended part way and become something that is no longer entirely human. Their blood is different in quality again. It carries a signal that ordinary blood does not carry. And above all of this is pale blood, the blood of the Great Ones themselves. Colourless, the game implies, thin as water to ordinary senses, but carrying within it the full weight of what the Great Ones are, their cognition, their dimensional reach, their capacity to exist simultaneously in the physical world and in the nightmare spaces that layer underneath it. When the note tells you to seek pale blood to transcend the hunt, it is telling you to find the highest tier, to connect with the source, to absorb enough of what is genuinely divine that the human-scale trap of the hunt, the endless night, the cycle of death and dream, cannot hold you. The game's true ending is the fulfillment of this instruction. You consume the umbilical cords. You face the moon. presence with the accumulated power of 3 Great One connections running through your blood, and you transcend. The hunt ends for you, not because you died and were released, not because Gehrman cut you down and sent you home, but because you became something that the hunt was not built to contain. You sought Paleblood, you found it. What makes Paleblood endure as Bloodborne's central mystery is not that it's unsolvable, it's that its solution is woven into the fabric of the game's themes rather than delivered as a fact. You don't find Paleblood in a chest with a glowing outline. You understand it slowly, the way you understand what a dream meant after you've had enough distance from it to see the pattern. It requires you to feel your way toward it rather than find it, and that act of feeling, that slow understanding arriving without announcement in the quiet of a long night's end, is itself a form of transcendence. You sought Paleblood, and perhaps in reaching the end and asking what it was, you've already found it. Every player who arrives in Yharnam begins in the same condition, knowing almost nothing about who they are. You have a name, or rather, you can choose a name from the character creator, which the game will then mostly ignore. You have a face you sculpted from sliders that feel like they understand something about impermanence. You signed a contract with a healing church blood minister before losing consciousness in a clinic bed, agreeing to something you didn't fully read in exchange for a blood transfusion. That is the entirety of your established identity. That is everything the game gives you. And yet the more you look at the evidence scattered throughout Bloodborne's world, the more a strange picture begins to assemble itself. You are not who the game pretends you are. You're not an anonymous traveller who simply happened to arrive at the wrong time and got swept up in something larger than themselves. There are too many coincidences, too many entities who seem to have been expecting you. Start with the most fundamental observation. The moon presence was waiting. When you arrive at the hunter's dream after your first death in the clinic, Gehrman is already there, already in his wheelchair, already tending his flowers, already treating you with the casual familiarity of someone who knew you would be coming, who has been managing the space in preparation for your arrival. The doll is already animated, which is itself significant because the doll should not be animated at all, and the game gives you an optional aside explaining that your presence is what woke her. The messengers already know where to bring your blood echoes. The workshop is stocked, everything is ready. There is no onboarding process, no moment of the moon presence discovering you and deciding you're worth the investment of a dream. No interview or trial. You arrive and the dream receives you the way a house receives a resident who has been expected. This implies selection, arrangement. You were not chosen during the events of the game. You were chosen before them. Someone or something determined at some point prior to your arrival in Yharnam that you were the hunter this night required. The umbilical cord mechanic deepens this. There are 4 fragments of 1/3 of umbilical cord available in the game, each representing a moment of contact between a human being and a Great One, a connection so intimate that it left a physical remnant. Murgo's cord, Ariana's cord, the cord in the abandoned old workshop, the cord from Iosefka's clinic. 3 of these can be consumed by the player character, and their combined power is sufficient to resist the moon presence's control entirely, to transform rather than be absorbed into the dream. The question this raises is quiet but persistent. Why you? Most humans exposed to Great One blood go mad. They become kin. Twisted and beautiful and non-functional, they become beasts. They break in ways that cannot be repaired. Even accomplished scholars with years of preparation, Micolash, the choir's most devoted members, are consumed or shattered by the contact they sought. You consume 3 umbilical cords and become an infant god. This implies that your blood was already capable of accepting what others cannot metabolize, that there is something in your specific biology, your specific relationship to the Great One's reality, that makes you able to process what kills everyone else, not because you are simply stronger or more determined, because you were already, in some meaningful biological sense, partway there. There is a theory, which I find compelling, that the player character's blood is connected to a previous generation of divine contact, that someone in your lineage, or you yourself in a past cycle of the dream, had enough proximity to a Great One to leave a mark in the blood that you then carry forward. This would explain both your resistance to the worst effects of blood ministration and the Moon Presence's specific interest in you among all the hunters who have cycled through the dream. You're not a random traveller. You are the product of an arrangement so long-running and so carefully maintained that even you don't know you're part of it. And what you become in the true ending, the infant Great One cradled by the doll, small and new and surrounded by messengers who look at you with something like reverence, is not an accident. It is a destination, one that the entire game, every death and every discovery and every accumulated echo, was moving you toward from the moment you signed that blood contract in the clinic. Who are you? You are the answer to a question the Moon Presence has been asking for longer than Yharnam has existed. Gehrman is among the most heartbreaking figures in all of FromSoftware's catalogue, and that is a category with extraordinary competition. He is old beyond what a human life should permit. He is confined to a wheelchair that he pushes through garden paths and workshop floors, unable to leave the dream, unable to age past what he is, unable to die. He tends flowers with the patience of someone who has had lifetimes to learn patience, and he greets passing hunters with a warmth that carries, if you listen to it carefully, an enormous sadness. He was the first hunter. He established the workshop, created the trick weapons, trained the generation that eventually became the hunters of Yharnam's current night. He built the tradition. He built the tools. He built Lady Maria, in the sense that she was his student, and he shaped what she became. He is the origin point of everything the game's world organized itself around, and his reward is an eternity of servitude in a garden that isn't real, tending flowers for hunters who pass through and leave and are eventually freed while he remains. The surface explanation, the Moon Presence bound him to the dream to serve as its caretaker, raises more questions than it answers. Why does the Moon Presence need a caretaker? What is the dream actually for, in the specific logistical sense that requires a human being to maintain it? And why does Gehrman seem not just imprisoned but broken by something more targeted and personal than mere captivity? The answer is in the abandoned old workshop, one of the game's most deliberately hidden locations. It requires a specific jump from a specific ledge in the cathedral ward to reach. A jump that has no obvious prompt, that is easy to miss entirely, and that rewards reaching it with one of the game's most quietly devastating pieces of environmental storytelling. The abandoned old workshop is the original physical version of the hunter's dream. It occupies the same space in the real Yharnam that the dream replicates, the same layout, the same workshop structure, the same general arrangement, but this version is decayed, dusty and cold, and long since stripped of the life that the dream version still artificially maintains. And in this workshop sits a plain doll, a small unanimated figure clearly made by hand, clearly the original template for the doll that waits for you in the dream. Gehrman built her, with his own hands, in this workshop, with an artisan's obsession and a craftsman's precision, applied to the specific project of preserving a face and a form that he could not otherwise keep. That face was Lady Maria's. Maria was the captain of the church hunters, Gehrman's finest student by most accounts. She was brilliant and ruthless and haunted, and she eventually locked herself away in the research hall and chose death, rather than continue as what she had become. Whether Gehrman knew before she died the depth of what she meant to him, whether she knew, these are questions the law does not answer, and perhaps is wise not to answer. What the law tells us is that he built her, that he preserved her in effigy, that when the moon presence took him into the dream, it brought the doll along and animated her. The doll of the hunter's dream is not Maria. She says so herself in one of the game's most quietly devastating lines, if you ask her. She is what Gehrman made her to be, a recreation, imperfect and perhaps aware of its own imperfection, speaking with a gentleness that may or may not reflect anything real about the woman who inspired her form. Whether the moon presence animated the doll as a kindness to Gehrman or as a cruelty is a question Bloodborne leaves in exactly the right amount of unresolved tension. The cruelty reading is vivid and awful. Gehrman is made to tend a simulacrum of the person he loved forever. She is there every time he turns around, present but not her, warm but hollow, a reminder at every waking moment of what he has lost and cannot reach, cannot mourn properly, cannot ever move on from because she is standing right there in the garden, watching the hunters come and go. The kindness reading is subtler. Even a pale imitation of Maria's presence was what Gehrman needed to survive the eternity of the dream. The moon presence gave him something to hold on to, however imperfectly, however incompletely. The alternative was unbroken isolation, and perhaps that was worse. Either way, Gehrman's imprisonment is not simply logistical. It is emotional in its specific design. It is a man kept alive long past the point of meaning, watching hunter after hunter come through, knowing they will be freed, eventually, cut down by his blade at the dream's edge and sent home in the morning, while he trims roses and talks to something that wears the face he made from grief. When he asks you to let him release you, when he tries to cut you down at the game's first ending, he is not being cruel. He has seen this so many times. He knows what happens to hunters who stay too long. He is trying to spare you what has been done to him, trying to send you home before the dream takes you the way the dream took him, before you become another person trapped in someone else's garden, talking to something that almost understands you. And if you refuse, if you fight him and win and release him from his servitude, which is among the cruelest mercies in a game full of them, what does he do? He wakes up in the real Yharnam, frail and bewildered and blinking in sunlight he hasn't seen in however long this has lasted, kneeling in the grass, looking up at a dawn that has no idea how much it means. The doll watches from the dream above and says she will always be there, even if you aren't. Gehrman gets to go. The doll stays. There is no clean ending for anyone in this game. but the dawn Gehrman sees is as close as anything here gets to grace. The two are not mutually exclusive. This is one of those questions where the framing itself is the most revealing part, where the act of holding both possibilities at once tells you more than committing to either would. Gehrman was unquestionably the first hunter in the historical sense. He founded the workshop. He originated the philosophy and the tools and the tradition. His legacy runs through every trick weapon in the game: the saw cleaver, the hunter axe, the threaded cane. His approach to hunting: fast, aggressive, unrelenting, always pressing, is the gameplay itself at a fundamental level. He built the thing that everyone else inherited. In that sense, he is the beginning of everything that matters. But there is strong evidence that the Moon Presence's investment in Gehrman was never simply about creating an effective hunt manager. The Moon Presence doesn't need an office administrator. It needed something more specific, and the possibility that Gehrman was chosen, for reasons that extended beyond his practical skills, and that he never fulfilled the deeper expectation, is worth examining carefully. The Moon Presence is a great one, and great ones grieve. This is stated explicitly. They lost their children, in ways the game specifies in some cases and implies in others, and they seek surrogates. They reach across the enormous distance between their reality and ours, looking for connections that might approximate what they lost. This is why Murgo's existence matters so much. This is why a great one would bother with Yharnam at all. Not for the hunting, not for the blood, for the possibility of connection. A hunter who becomes truly extraordinary, who accumulates enough insight, absorbs enough of the Great One's reality, survives long enough, and experiences enough, could potentially become something beyond human, could become, in some sense, a child, something that the Moon Presence could look at and recognize, something that could look back. Was that what the Moon Presence wanted from Gehrman? Not a caretaker of the hunt, but a potential ascendant. The first attempt at producing someone who could make the crossing. And did Gehrman simply not make it? His current state supports this reading painfully well. He is ancient, far older than any human lifespan should allow, sustained in the dream far beyond what would be natural. He has accumulated more experience than any other person in the game's history. He has been exposed to the Great One's reality for longer than any scholar, any cleric, any hunter who came after. He has sat at the Moon Presence's side, functionally if not literally, for all of that time, and he is still in a wheelchair, still human, still aging, or preserved at an age, unable to cross whatever threshold would represent the transformation the Moon Presence was waiting for. He grew old inside the dream and did not change. He never transcended. He never became the something new that the true ending demonstrates is possible. So the Moon Presence kept him, kept the dream running, kept sending hunters through one after another, looking for the specific quality, the specific blood that Gehrman possessed some of but not enough of, iterating, testing. The hunt as a function of a longer project that Gehrman was the first draft of, and you are the draft that finally worked. In this reading, Gehrman is not diminished. He was the necessary beginning of something that took many iterations to reach its conclusion. He was the first to come close enough to matter, the first to demonstrate that a hunter could accumulate enough of the right kind of experience to approach the threshold, the first to give the Moon Presence reason to believe that a human could make the crossing. He just wasn't the one who got to make it. He was the first hunter, yes, and in the Moon Presence's patient accounting, perhaps also the most necessary failure. She is there every time you return to the hunter's dream. She levels you up. She prays for you in terms that suggest she takes her praying seriously. She speaks in a voice that has been compared by reviewers and players and people writing about it years later to a candle lit in a cold room, small and warm and insufficient to change the temperature, but present in a way that matters. She is one of the most beloved characters in FromSoftware's history. She's also genuinely mysterious in ways that her gentleness makes easy to overlook. Let's start with what we know for certain. The doll is a crafted object. Gehrman built her by hand in the abandoned old workshop, using Lady Maria as a model, as an expression of grief and devotion that took physical form because Gehrman was someone who expressed things through his hands. She is not a human. She was not born. She was constructed. Artisan's work applied to the project of preservation, and whatever she is now, that is what she was at the beginning. But she is also clearly more than a crafted object, and has been for as long as the dream has existed. She moves with a grace that mechanical things don't possess. She speaks with a quality of interiority that suggests something going on inside her beyond the function of leveling you up. She tells you, if you speak to her enough, that she doesn't know why she was given life, and the uncertainty in that statement is real. She's not performing confusion. She genuinely doesn't know what she is or why she exists, and she has made a kind of peace with that unknowing that is itself a form of wisdom. The most mechanically significant thing the doll does is give you power. She takes your blood echoes, the accumulated residue of every life you've ended and every experience you've survived, and converts them into insight and levels. This is not a neutral function. It implies that she can touch the substance of lived experience and transform it into something usable, that she has access to a process that is, in the game's cosmological terms, genuinely significant. Ordinary humans don't do this. Blood ministration changes people, gives them access to the Great One's resonance, but it doesn't give them the ability to metabolize someone else's accumulated echoes into power. That requires a connection to the dream's underlying mechanism that goes beyond what the blood alone could explain. The doll is, in some meaningful sense, an extension of the Moon Presence's will in the dream space. Not a servant exactly. She doesn't feel like a servant, but a function, a node in the dream's architecture. The messengers carry things, the workshop provides tools, and the doll provides progression, all of it sustained by the same source. Whether she knows this is one of the questions the game carefully doesn't answer. The theory that she carries some imprint of Lady Maria is one of the more emotionally resonant readings in Bloodborne's lore, discourse. Maria was a hunter of extraordinary intensity, the kind of intensity that leaves marks on the spaces it moves through. She was Gehrman's finest student, and she became one of the most skilled and most haunted figures in Yharnam's history. She participated in things she couldn't live with. She locked herself away and chose death over continuation. That kind of life, that specific combination of extraordinary ability and unbearable guilt, doesn't just evaporate. The lore of FromSoftware's games is full of impressions that persist past the point of the person who made them. And the doll was made from Gehrman's specific, obsessive, grief-driven love for the person Maria was. It would be strange if she carried nothing of that. Whether the doll's gentleness is a quality that Gehrman built into her, his idealized version of Maria, the warmth without the violence, or whether it reflects something of Maria's actual nature that survived the medium of translation, the game doesn't say. It gives you the feeling of the question without resolving it. At the true ending, the doll cradles your transformed form, the infant Great One you've become, and speaks to you in a register that is unmistakably maternal. She treats you with the care of someone looking at something new and vulnerable and precious, something that needs to be held carefully until it understands what it is. That moment is the most complete expression of what the doll is, not a tool, not a simulacrum, something that has, over the long time of the dream, developed a quality of care that exceeds its original function, something that prays for you and means it. What is the doll? She is what love looks like when love has been given a form and then left alone long enough to become real. Byrgenwerth is a university, or it was before the schism, before the founding of the Healing Church, before Master Willem retreated into himself, and the world he had helped to reshape moved on without him. Now it's a ruin on the edge of a still lake, threaded through with silk and guarded by a creature that was once a human scholar. But once, in the period the game calls the early age of the church, Byrgenwerth was the most important institution in the world, because Byrgenwerth found something. The ruins beneath Yharnam predate the city above by a span of time that is difficult to conceptualize. The Thumerian civilization, the ancient people who built those underground labyrinths and filled them with their dead and their devotions, existed long before the city that would eventually grow above them. The Thumerians had their own relationship with the Great Ones, direct and unmediated by any church or school. They had come into contact with divine blood through proximity, alone, living so close to the Great One's tombs, performing rituals of communion for generations, absorbing something into their culture and their biology that could not be removed. And they had been consumed by it. When Byrgenwerth scholars descended into those ruins, which required considerable bravery or considerable recklessness, and in the specific case of early Byrgenwerth these may have been the same quality, they found the remnants of a civilization that had reached further than it could hold. They found tomb after tomb. They found ritual spaces for the rite of communion, the practice of drinking Great One blood directly, bypassing every safeguard that distance and metaphor might provide. They found the evidence of what that practice had produced over generations of application, and they found something living. The infant Great One that would later become the centre of the nightmare of Mensis was encountered at some level by the Byrgenwerth scholars during these early excavations. The connection isn't stated explicitly in any single item description, but it is implied by the sequence of events and the specific motivations that emerge from the split between Willem and Laurence. They found something down there that changed what they thought was possible. Something that made the abstract question of contact with the Great Ones suddenly urgently concrete. More critically, more foundationally, they found ease. The discovery that underlies all of Byrgenwerth's subsequent work and all of the Healing Church's subsequent disaster is deceptively simple. That the path to higher understanding runs through the acquisition of perception, of eyes. Not necessarily literal eyes, Though the game uses the metaphor with deliberate physical specificity, there are items in the game that are simply eyes, and the description of advanced insight involves eyes appearing on the insides of bodies, but more broadly the capacity for perception that ordinary human senses don't possess. The Great Ones exist at a frequency of reality that most people can't access, not because they're hiding, not because the access is forbidden, but because the human sensory apparatus wasn't built to receive the signal. It's like trying to hear a frequency outside the range of human hearing. Not a moral or metaphysical barrier, just a biological one. Blood, specifically Great One blood, or blood transformed by contact with Great Ones, can retune the receiver. It can expand what you can perceive beyond what your body was originally equipped for. This is what insight represents mechanically in the game. The more you accumulate, the more of the hidden world becomes visible. More messengers appear at your feet. Enemies that were invisible manifest. The Winter Lantern's hypnotic, agonizing faces are only visible past a certain threshold. Reality, as it actually is, rather than the edited version that ordinary human perception presents. What Byrgenwerth found in the Chalice dungeons was proof of this mechanism, evidence that blood could unlock cognition in ways that philosophy and scholarship and education simply could not touch. That the path to understanding the Great Ones was biological before it was intellectual, and that discovery split the institution precisely in two. Betray is Willem's word, or at least the word the law deploys in his voice. Laurence would likely not have called it that. He would have called it progress, a difference in methodology, a willingness to do what needed to be done. Both men descended into the Thumerian ruins. Both men saw the same evidence. Both men understood, in broad terms, that blood was the mechanism and that the body was the vessel. And both men drew completely different conclusions about what to do with that understanding. Willem concluded that the proper approach was cautious and contemplative. His philosophy, developed over years of sitting with the evidence and pushing his own perceptual limits through the insertion of literal eyes into his own skull, through the accumulation of insight at a pace his mind could manage, was about becoming a better receiver, about developing the capacity to perceive what the Great Ones perceive without trying to absorb it all at once, without trying to use the blood as a delivery system for rapid transformation. His famous line, "We are born of the blood, made men by the blood, undone by the blood," sounds at first reading like a warning. And it is a warning, but it's also a statement of profound ambivalence about the substance that he has spent his life studying. Blood is the beginning of human existence and the mechanism of human potential, but also the specific agent of human destruction if handled carelessly. Willem understood all three of these things simultaneously, and never stopped understanding them. Laurence looked at the same evidence and decided that caution was a form of cowardice dressed up in philosophical language. He was ambitious in a way that Willem was not. He saw the blood not as something to be approached carefully and metabolized slowly, but as something to be used, deployed, industrialized. He brought a sample of Great One blood back from the Chalice dungeons, likely with Willem's knowledge, possibly with his blessing at the time, and founded the Healing Church on the practice of distributing it therapeutically. Blood ministration, the delivery of Great One blood to patients as a medical treatment, framed as divine healing, built into a religious institution that gave it both moral authority and administrative infrastructure. The church grew quickly because the blood worked. It cured things that should not have been curable. It gave strength to the weak and clarity to the confused. It was genuinely remarkable, and the people of Yharnam accepted it with the enthusiasm of a population that had been sick for a long time and had just been offered something that seemed like a miracle. The betrayal from Willem's perspective was not primarily personal. It was philosophical. Willem had argued, had explained, clearly and with evidence, that the Thumerian ruins demonstrated exactly what happened when blood was distributed at scale without understanding that the Thumerians hadn't been fools. They had been scholars and devotees who believed in what they were doing, and they had been consumed anyway because the blood doesn't care about intention. Laurence believed the Thumerians had simply not known what they were doing. That modern scholarship, Byrgenwerth scholarship, his scholarship, could manage what an ancient civilization could not. That the difference between catastrophe and transcendence was knowledge, and he had the knowledge, and so the catastrophe would not apply to him. He was wrong about the scale and the speed. He was right that blood could transform people. He simply failed to predict, or chose not to predict, that distributing it through an entire city's population would not produce a city of philosophers. It would produce beasts. The schism between Byrgenwerth and the early healing church is therefore not a falling out between two colleagues over a policy dispute. It is the central intellectual tragedy of Bloodborne's entire world. It is the moment when the knowledge that had been recovered from the ruins, knowledge that came with clear warnings baked into the evidence, was taken and used at scale without heeding those warnings, and everything that followed was the consequence. Willem retreated, continued his research in isolation, became something that was not quite human anymore, in a place that was no longer quite a university, watching the city his protégé built slowly drown in its own blood. He was right about all of it, and it didn't matter at all. The healing church fractures across its history into competing factions, each with its own vision of what blood is for and where it should lead humanity. The choir is the faction that operated out of the upper cathedral ward, sealed off from the rest of Yharnam, accessible only through a key obtained in a specific and easily missed way, its entrance marked by a locked door that the game offers no obvious reason to open. What the choir was doing up there was not healing. It was not, in any meaningful sense, medicine. It was not even scholarship in the Byrgenwerth tradition of careful accumulation. The choir had a specific and radical goal. They wanted to produce a being capable of communing directly with the Great Ones, not through blood, not through insight accumulated gradually over a lifetime, through biological modification, through the physical transformation of human beings into something capable of receiving the Great One's signal without breaking. Their key asset was Ebrietas, the Great One called the Daughter of the Cosmos, found in the Chalice dungeons left behind when the others departed, the one who stayed for reasons the lore suggests but doesn't confirm. Ebrietas had a relationship with the choir unlike anything the rest of the church could claim. She communicated with them, or allowed herself to be communicated with, in ways that gave the choir information and methods that no other faction possessed. The Celestial Emissary program was the result. Using concentrated Great One blood, Ebrietas's blood presumably, or blood derived from contact with her, the choir attempted to transform human volunteers into something that could survive direct communion with a Great One. The results are the bulbous, pale, quietly terrible creatures that populate the upper cathedral ward, celestial emissaries, humanoid but not human, able to perceive in ways ordinary people cannot, capable of a kind of communion with Abritus that their original bodies would have been destroyed by. Whether this was progress toward the goal or a catastrophic compromise depends on your definition of success. The emissaries are not transcendent, they are not gods, they are not even particularly impressive in a fight, compared to most of what Bloodborne puts in your way. But they do exist in a register of reality that is adjacent to the Great One's register in a way that unmodified humans do not. They can serve as intermediaries, they can hold the connection open without being shattered by it. The choir's deeper ambition, the one that was never fully articulated because they never got close enough to articulating it clearly, was to push further than the emissary program, to take the transformation all the way, to produce a being who did not simply approach the Great One's mode of existence but achieved it. Not a human who could tolerate divine contact, a human who crossed over and became something on the other side. They never achieved it, or if they did, the achievement is not visible in the game's present tense events. The upper cathedral ward is full of emissaries and the echo of a project that ran until it ran out of willing volunteers or viable methods or both. Ebrietas is still there, enormous and alien and weeping at her altar, perhaps grieving for the people who tried and couldn't make it, perhaps simply being what she is. But the ambition itself deserves acknowledgement. The choir was asking the same question that Byrgenwerth had always been asking, the question that is Bloodborne's core question, in a more direct and more costly way than anyone before them. Is there a path from what we are to what they are? Can a human being with enough preparation and enough sacrifice become something the Great Ones would recognize? They believed yes. They paid for that belief with the bodies of their volunteers. And the question remains open, answered only by the true ending of the game itself, by a player character who gets there through a path that none of the choir's methods quite reached. This is one of the sadder questions in the game, because the honest answer is nothing. Nothing dramatic, nothing violent, nothing that would make a good story in the conventional sense. Byrgenwerth became irrelevant. When Laurence left, taking with him the scholars who shared his vision, the blood sample that would become the foundation of the healing church and what amounted to the institution's energy and momentum, he took the future with him. The healing church grew into something powerful and resourced and visible. It built cathedrals, it trained hunters, it put blood ministration into the hands of every citizen of Yharnam. It became the definitive institution of the age. Byrgenwerth, by contrast, retreated into itself. Willem continued his research alone, or nearly alone, inserting eyes into his own head, accumulating insight at the deliberate pace of someone who believes that speed is precisely the problem. He watched the world outside fall apart in slow motion, the beast plague emerging, the hunts becoming necessary, the church's power growing alongside the disaster it was producing, and said nothing publicly, did nothing to stop it. Perhaps understood that nothing he said would matter to people who had already chosen their direction. The university didn't burn or collapse or get purged. It simply persisted in diminishment, increasingly cut off from the events its own discoveries had set in motion. A ruin that was mostly quiet. The presence of Rom in the lake adjacent to Byrgenwerth complicates this picture interestingly. Rom, a scholar herself, transformed by her own work or by Willem's, was placed in the lake to maintain the veil that prevents ordinary people from perceiving the eldritch truth underlying Yharnam's reality. This is an active function, performed by a being who was once Byrgenwerth's own, suggesting that even in its diminishment the university was not entirely disconnected from the larger forces shaping the world. Rom's placement may have been Willem's final act of relevance, his last contribution to the management of the catastrophe he had predicted. By sealing the truth behind Rom's veil, by preventing ordinary people from seeing what the blood had actually done and what the Great Ones actually were, Willem ensured that the world could continue to function, that not everyone would go mad at once, that the hunters could keep hunting and the church could keep ministering, and the city could keep pretending that it had things under control, even as the nightmare spread underneath. When you fight your way to Master Willem at the end of Byrgenwerth, he is nearly gone, immobile in his rocking chair, reaching toward the lake, muttering fragments that suggest a mind stretched enormously thin over a span of experience too long and too full of grief to summarize. He is waiting. The specific object of his waiting is not named. Perhaps he is waiting for someone to arrive who is finally far enough along the path that a conversation with them would mean something. Perhaps he is waiting for the night to end, a night that has, for him, lasted decades. Perhaps he is simply waiting for the accumulated weight of all that knowing to finally resolve into something like rest. He doesn't attack you. He doesn't speak in full sentences. He reaches toward the lake, and that reaching is the only thing he has left. Byrgenwerth after the split is what it looks like when you were right about everything and it didn't matter at all. The nightmare of Mensis is not chaos. It is not simply a place where terrible things happen to scholars who reached too far and paid the price of that reaching. It is a constructed space. It has architecture, it has purpose, it has a logic that operates consistently if you understand what the logic is trying to accomplish. And understanding that logic requires stepping back from the horror of it and asking, as calmly as possible, what function this nightmare was built to serve. Begin with the physical situation. Micolash and the scholars of the School of Mensis performed a ritual, the specifics of which the game doesn't fully describe, but whose components we can piece together, that allowed them to project their consciousnesses into the nightmare while leaving their physical bodies behind in Yharnam. Their bodies were hung in cages, connected by fluid conduits to a great brain that sat in the lowest level of the building, a massive, pulsing, horrible thing that served as the biological anchor for the entire operation. The scholars' minds were in the nightmare. Their bodies were infrastructure. Inside the nightmare, they found Ergo, the infant Great One whose crying has been filling the nightmare and bleeding through into the waking world for as long as the school's operation has been running. The blood-red moon over Yharnam, the visual signal that the barrier between the physical world and the nightmare has thinned dangerously, is a direct consequence of Murgo's presence in the nightmare being sustained by the Mensis ritual. But why sustain it? What was the School of Mensis trying to do with Murgo? The answer involves the umbilical cord. Each contact between a human being and a Great One leaves a physical remnant, a cord, a token, a piece of the connection that persisted in material form after the connection itself faded. These cords carry enormous power. They are, in some literal biological sense, the substance of divine contact, and Murgo, as an infant Great One, born or dying or existing in some state the game describes with careful ambiguity, has one. The school wanted that cord. They believed that possessing it would allow them to complete the transformation they were seeking, to fully bridge the gap between human cognition and Great One cognition, to achieve the kind of ascent that the choir was also pursuing through different means. The nightmare was not an accident they fell into. It was a space they constructed and maintained in order to keep Murgo accessible, to keep the connection open long enough to harvest what they needed. The crying that fills the nightmare is the mechanism that keeps the operation alive. As long as Murgo cries, the nightmare persists. As long as the nightmare persists, the school's access to the infant Great One continues. The blood-red moon is a side effect, a sign that the boundary is thin, that the nightmare is pressing against reality, that Yharnam is gradually being consumed by the space the school opened. There is a layer beneath this that the lore implies rather than states directly. Murgo may be dead. The game describes the Great One's grief for their lost children, their search for surrogates, their reaching across the cosmic distance toward humans who might fill the space left by something that cannot be recovered. Murgo's status is ambiguous. The wet nurse that tends the infant is not a protector. It is something more like a sustained response to grief, an entity that keeps doing its job because the job never officially ended. If Murgo is dead, then what Mensis found in the nightmare was not a living Great One. It was a haunting. A ghost sustained past the point of natural dissolution by the school's ritual, kept present and kept crying because the ritual requires the crying to continue. The nightmare in this reading is a machine built around a grief that cannot end, or rather, that has been prevented from ending. When you destroy the brain of Mensis and free the nightmare from its anchor, when you face Murgo's wet nurse and silence the crying at last, you are not defeating something malevolent in the conventional sense. You are allowing something to finally stop. The nightmare is for harvesting, but what it has become over the course of the school's operation is something more like a prison. For Murgo, for the scholars themselves, for the entire system of sustained anguish that the school built in pursuit of something they never quite reached. Micolash is the game's most theatrical figure. He runs, he laughs, he screams about formless Whedon and the Grant of Eyes, and Koz, whom he somehow knows about in terms that suggest the knowledge came at significant cost. He wears an iron cage on his head and seems, from a certain angle, to be having the time of his life in his own personal nightmare. He is easy to dismiss as simply mad, as someone whose reach exceeded his grasp so dramatically that he crossed the line between visionary and casualty, and the right response to him is to find him, fight him, and move on. But the question of whether he was right, whether the madness was actually a form of insight that the saner characters lacked, deserves more than dismissal. Micolash's core desire was for the grant of ease. He wanted to see what the Great Ones see, not to observe them from a careful scholarly distance, not to theorize about their reality from the safe remove of academic discourse, to actually access the cognitive mode of beings for whom the ordinary rules of existence are irrelevant, to think the way they think, to perceive the way they perceive, to stop being a human being who studies Great Ones and become something that could stand in the same conceptual space as them. His specific invocations are revealing. Kos, the Great One of the Deep, of the ocean, of the parasite and the village, is not the obvious deity to invoke for this kind of prayer. Kos is associated with the fishing hamlet, with the church's oldest crime, with the specific cost of treating a god as a resource. Micolash invoking Kos suggests he knew about the hamlet at some level, that his knowledge of the Great Ones extended into the territory that the church most wanted buried. Formless Uden is the other central invocation, and Uden represents the ultimate form of what Micolash was seeking, a Great One who exists purely as a cognitive entity, no body, no physical form, pure thought, pure awareness, pure perception, extending through the world without the limitation of flesh. If Uden is what a Great One looks like when the biological is stripped away, then praying to Uden for the grant of eyes is praying for exactly what Micolash describes: access to a mode of cognition that transcends the physical. Was he right that this was worth pursuing? The game's answer is yes and no, and the distinction it draws is instructive. The evidence that some version of what Micolash was seeking is genuinely possible is built into the true ending of the game. A player who has consumed enough umbilical cords, who has accumulated enough insight, who has lived fully through the night the game describes, that player becomes something new, something that the moon presence could not contain, something that the dream's ordinary ending cannot claim. The path Micolash was gesturing toward was not entirely delusional. The destination was real, but the path he chose was catastrophically wrong, and the specific nature of his error is worth understanding. Micolash projected his consciousness into the nightmare while his physical body remained behind, hung in a cage in Yharnam, sustained minimally. He separated himself from his flesh in order to access the nightmare's higher frequency reality. He believed the body was an obstacle, a limitation, something to be left behind while the mind went ahead. What this produced was not elevation, it was fragmentation. He exists fully in neither realm. His mind in the nightmare has no grounding in physical reality, no feedback from the embodied experience that gives human cognition its coherence. His body in Yharnam has no direction from a consciousness that has gone somewhere else. He is split across two spaces and whole in neither. Real transcendence, the kind that works, the kind the true ending demonstrates, requires the integration of body and insight, not their separation. You consume the umbilical cords while alive. You accumulate insight while still physically present in the world. You face the moon presence as an embodied being who has expanded what their embodiment can receive. The flesh isn't the obstacle, it's the vehicle. Micolash got the goal right, and the method exactly wrong. He understood that ordinary human consciousness was insufficient for contact with the Great Ones. He understood that the gap needed to be bridged somehow. He was simply wrong about which side of the gap needed to move toward which. "Grant us eyes," he says, from inside his nightmare cage. "Grant us eyes on the inside." He was asking the right question. He was already standing in the wrong place when he asked it. The standard path to Bloodborne's nightmare realms involves death. Not always permanent death. The player character experiences something more like a permeable version of it, dying to a beast in Iosefka's clinic and waking in the hunter's dream rather than simply ceasing. But the threshold in both cases is the boundary between living consciousness and the state of consciousness that the nightmare can reach. You have to go through something like death to get through the door. The School of Mensis didn't want to die. They wanted to be in the nightmare while their bodies remained intact and alive in the physical world. This would give them ongoing, controllable access to Mergo. Not a one-time crossing, but a sustained connection they could maintain and use and, in theory, withdraw from when they chose. The mechanism they developed involved two components working in concert. The first was the Mensis cage. The iron helmets that Micolash and several other Mensis scholars wear are not decorative and not purely symbolic. Their item description says specifically that they are used to contact the Great Ones and to partially contain the resulting cognitive strain, the madness that direct contact with Great One reality produces in unprotected minds. The cage mediates the signal. It lets the mind receive what the nightmare is broadcasting without the full force of that broadcasting shattering the mind entirely. It's crude, it's imperfect. The scholars wearing it are clearly not in good shape, but it does what it needs to do. The second component was the brain of Mensis, the enormous biological mass in the lowest level of Yharnam, connected by fluid conduits to the hanging bodies of the scholars above. The brain is the anchor. Without it, the projection would not hold. The connection between the physical bodies left behind and the consciousnesses projected into the nightmare would sever, and the scholars' minds would be stranded. The brain maintains both ends of the equation, keeping the bodies minimally alive and keeping the projected consciousnesses tethered to their physical origin. This is why the scholars in Yharnam look the way they do. They are there, but they are not present. Their minds are elsewhere. Their bodies are life support systems for the connection rather than homes for living people. They hang because the brain is what is holding them up, and the brain doesn't bother with the dignity of posture. The elegance of the mechanism, the intellectual achievement it represents, deserves acknowledgement even while you're dismantling it. Micolash and the school solved, in practical terms, the problem of maintaining consciousness across the threshold of the nightmare while keeping a physical anchor in the living world. That is not a small thing. Byrgenwerth spent its entire existence trying to understand the mechanism of the Great One's reality without crossing into it. The choir was trying to transform the body to match the Great One's mode of existence. Mensis found a third approach: send the mind ahead and leave the body behind as a placeholder. The problem is that the placeholder degrades. The body, sustained by a brain it has no conscious relationship with, is not living in any meaningful sense. It is simply not dead yet. And the mind in the nightmare, cut off from the grounding that embodied existence provides, becomes increasingly untethered, increasingly the kind of person who laughs while running through a nightmare maze, who prays to formless Eden, who has been in a state of dislocated existence for long enough that the dislocation is no longer recognizable as a problem. When you destroy the brain of Mensis, you collapse the anchor. The connection severs, and Micolash, wherever his consciousness is in the nightmare, simply ends, because the thing that was keeping the projection stable has been removed. They got there while alive, they just weren't alive in any useful sense by the time you arrived to close what they opened. The fishing hamlet is Bloodborne's oldest wound. Everything in the DLC, Lady Maria's guilt, the existence of the old hunter's nightmare, the orphan of Kos waiting on the beach, The specific and terrible quality of the horror in the research hall traces back to an event in a small coastal village that the church wanted buried so completely it created an entire nightmare to contain the memory. Here is the story as the lore assembles it. Gehrman's hunters, the original generation before the Healing Church formalized and institutionalized the hunter tradition, received word that a Great One had come ashore and died, or was dying, on a beach at a remote fishing settlement. Kos was her name, or the name she was given. She was connected to the ocean, to the deep, to the parasitic organisms that carry life between worlds, and she had come to this particular shore and stopped moving. She was not alone. Inside her body, protected by whatever biology a Great One's pregnancy involves, was the entity that would become the orphan of Kos, not yet born, not yet capable of grief, waiting in the manner of things waiting to exist. The villagers of the hamlet had been living in Kos's proximity for long enough to be changed by that proximity. It didn't require blood ministration or rituals or any of the apparatus that the Healing Church had built around the transmission of Great One influence. Simple proximity over time had been sufficient. Their blood had shifted. Their perception had expanded. Their eyes were different from ordinary eyes in ways you can still see in their descendants, the Fishwitch creatures, the hamlet's remaining inhabitants at the time the game's DLC takes place. They were still human, but human in the way that generations of exposure to divine reality makes things human, stretched, altered, more than they had been, and less stable as a result. The hunters descended on the hamlet. What followed was not study, it was not rescue or protection, or any of the functions that hunters were nominally supposed to serve. It was a slaughter and a harvest, conducted with the efficiency of people who had decided what they needed and were prepared to do what getting it required. The villagers were killed, all of them, for their blood, changed and valuable to the church's research agenda, and for access to Kos's body. The hunters harvested what they could reach of Kos's divine biology. They extracted the Kos parasite, the organisms living within her that were, in some sense, the mechanism of her influence on the hamlet. They took her eyes. They took what the church wanted them to take. The orphan was not born during this event, or perhaps it was born in the immediate aftermath, bursting from a mother already desecrated, arriving into a world where the only humans it could immediately perceive were the ones who had just killed everyone who had lived in proximity to her. It emerged holding what appears to be a placental mass, screaming in a way that has been described over and over by players encountering it for the first time as one of the most disturbing sounds in gaming. Not because it is loud, or because it is strange, but because it is recognizably the sound of grief, of something that has just understood what has been done and cannot process it. The great brain at the bottom of Yharnam, the Mensis scholar's anchor, has a detail that connects it to this history. It has eyes, many eyes. Eyes that were harvested from the hamlet, from Kos, from the villagers. The brain of Mensis is in part built from the harvest of the fishing hamlet. Lady Maria was there. She was Gehrman's finest student, the captain of the church hunters, the person who directed and participated in what was done. The research hall, where patients were experimented on with concentrated blood, was her subsequent posting, and the soul-corroding guilt of what she had done in the hamlet was what she brought with her into that work. She eventually could not continue. She sequestered herself. She sealed the clock tower. She cut her own wrists rather than remain in existence as the person who had participated in what happened on that beach. The old hunter's nightmare exists specifically to contain the memory of this event. The church could not allow what was done in the hamlet to become common knowledge, could not allow the first generation of hunters to return to the waking world and eventually tell someone what had happened. So the nightmare claimed them. Their memories were sealed inside it, cycling endlessly, bound to the scene of what they had done for as long as the nightmare persisted. The fishing hamlet is Bloodborne's original sin, not blood ministration, not the beast plague, not Byrgenwerth or the church or any of the institutions that came later. The original sin is the decision that a great one's body was a resource to be harvested, and that the people who had lived alongside her were acceptable casualties of that harvesting. Everything else is consequence. This is one of those questions that seems small, a detail question, a continuity puzzle, but opens into something significant when you follow it. The skull is in the hunter's nightmare. Its item description confirms it belongs to the founder of the healing church, Laurence, the first vicar, the man who took blood from Byrgenwerth and built a religion around it. His physical skull, preserved across whatever catastrophe ended his life, and kept somehow in this nightmare space. Laurence also appears as a boss in the DLC. He is a cleric beast, one of the most advanced forms of beasthood in the game, his lower body already transformed into fire, enormous and terrible, and still somehow wearing the shape of the man he was in the structure of his upper body. He is Laurence, the first vicar, fully consumed by the transformation he spent his life believing he could control and distribute safely. The combination of the skull and the boss asks the same question from two directions. What is the founder of the healing church doing in a nightmare built to contain the guilt of the old hunters? The answer is that Laurence was not simply a bystander to the fishing hamlet. The old hunters served the early church. Their operations were not independent of the institution Laurence was building. The work they did in the hamlet served the church's research agenda directly. The Kos parasite, the harvested blood, the biological material taken from a dead Great One and her slaughtered village, these fed into the programs the church was running. The choir's emissary program, the research that would eventually produce the brain of Mensis, the particular quality of blood that made Yharnam's ministration so effective for so long, all of it connects somewhere in the supply chain to what was taken from the hamlet. Laurence may not have been present on the beach. The law doesn't place him there explicitly, but he ordered the operation or approved it or simply ensured that its results were integrated into his church's work without asking too many questions about how they were obtained. In any of those cases, the hamlet is his to own. His skull in the nightmare is either a deliberate placement by someone who wanted the architect of the blood ministry to remain connected to the specific crime that ministry rested on, or it is the nightmare itself asserting accountability, claiming the material remnant of someone whose guilt belongs to the space, and his form as a beast completes the circuit with an elegance that Bloodborne rarely makes explicit. He spread the blood. He dismissed the warnings. He was confident that knowledge and intention would protect him and his institution from the consequences. He became those consequences. The fire consuming his lower body is the Laurence fire, connected to the specific heat of beasthood in its advanced stages, to the specific destruction that the blood he distributed tends toward at scale. There is something in his boss fight that is not quite villainous. He is enormous and terrible and will absolutely kill you if you let him. But he is also, in the shape of him, clearly something that has lost something. He carries himself with the specific movement of something that used to be more than this and knows it. He is what the Blood Ministry was always going to become, given enough time and enough scale. He is his own legacy in a form that cannot be argued with. Lady Meria is waiting for you at the top of the astral clock tower, and she will not step aside. She has been waiting for a very long time. Her body should be dead, she made certain of that, cutting her own wrists, choosing the ending rather than the continuation. And yet here she is, present in the nightmare, standing in the space between you and what is above, not quite alive and not quite gone. Why does she stay? Why does she guard this particular door? The research hall is what she is protecting. Above the clock tower, past her threshold, are the rooms where the healing church conducted its most ethically catastrophic experiments in concentrated blood. Patients, voluntary in the nominal sense, which in Yharnam's system of power meant little, were given doses far beyond anything used in therapeutic ministration. The goal was to push the boundary of human perception, to induce the kind of expanded cognition that the choir was pursuing through their emissary program, but in human subjects whose bodies were not modified first. The patients developed eyes, not metaphorically, physically. Eyes appeared in their skulls, in their skin, in the spaces their ordinary anatomy was vacating as it reorganized itself around the new perceptual load. They could see more and more. They could perceive things in the research hall's particular reality that ordinary people cannot access. But the framework of their human cognition, the structure that allows perception to be processed and communicated, had not kept pace with the expansion of what they were receiving. They could see everything and say nothing. They could perceive what they perceived but could not organize it into anything communicable. They were trapped inside a sensory experience that had outgrown the language for it. Maria was the captain of the hunters who enforced this work. She didn't design the experiments. She didn't choose the patients, but she kept people inside who wanted out. She provided the security that made the research possible. She made sure the work continued, and then she reached a point where she couldn't. The fishing hamlet had already been accumulating in her. The slaughter on the beach, the harvest of a dead god, the killing of people whose only crime was proximity to something sacred that had been living in her for however long it takes an experience like that to become unbearable. The research hall added weight to weight. She was the tool that kept the church's worst work running, and she reached a point where being that tool was something she could no longer permit herself to be. She sealed the clock tower. She went below it. She cut her wrists. Her presence in the nightmare as a guardian is not a mission assigned to her by the moon presence or the church or anyone else. It is her own choice, made from inside the nightmare, sustained by whatever form of will the nightmare preserves in its occupants. She put herself there because the only form of accountability she could access was being the barrier she should have been when the research hall was running. She cannot undo what happened. She cannot release the patients. She cannot change what she was part of, but she can stand between what she enabled and the next person who comes looking for it. The tragedy of her position is that the thing she is guarding access to is also, in the DLC's structure, the path to Simon the Harrowed, and the patients she could never help, and the larger truth of what the church did. She's protecting a wound by standing in front of it, not healing it, not closing it, just making it harder to reach. When you fight her, and it is one of the game's most beautiful and most reluctant boss fights, the movement of someone who has already made peace with being defeated but is not going to make it easy. She escalates. She summons the blood, her wounds lighting up, fighting with a ferocity that was always there underneath the stillness. She is not trying to kill you with malice. She's trying to be the barrier she should have been years before. She's trying to be what she wasn't, and she covers her face when it ends. A gesture of what? Shame, relief. The particular quality of acceptance that comes when something you've been holding is finally taken from you. She was protecting what she had done by being unable to undo it, and when you come along far enough, strong enough, ready to receive what's above, perhaps she recognizes that the time for guarding is over, that the nightmare has finally sent someone who can go where she could not, who can look at what she helped create and not be destroyed by the looking. She was the barrier. You were what finally came through. Every question we have walked through tonight has something in common. They are not questions born of sloppy writing or lazy design or a developer who ran out of time and left things unfinished. They are questions that were placed deliberately, planted with the care of someone who understood that the right mystery, carefully tended and never prematurely resolved, creates a kind of meaning that explicit answers cannot produce, that the act of wondering, sustained at the right temperature and in the right conditions, can feel more like truth than any explanation. Bloodborne is a game about the limits of knowledge, about what happens to people who want to know things they are not constitutionally equipped to understand, who reach for the insight and find that the insight reaches back, that the act of opening yourself to what is beyond ordinary perception is not a neutral act, that you cannot unsee what you have seen or unknow what you have known, about the gap between what we are and what we might become, and the beautiful, terrible cost of trying to cross it without enough wisdom to navigate the crossing cleanly. Gehrman, who loved someone he built into a doll and then spent eternity in a garden that wasn't real, tending flowers and watching hunters come and go, unable to mourn properly because the object of his grief was right there, animated and gentle and not quite her. Laurence, who believed in the blood with a conviction so complete that he became what the blood always makes of people who believe in it that way, who built a religion around a substance whose warnings he had personally read and chose to ignore because he thought he was the exception. Maria, who followed orders she should have refused in a hamlet that should have been protected and then spent the rest of her existence standing guard over the consequences of what she couldn't undo. Micolash, who understood the question, who saw clearly that ordinary human consciousness was insufficient for the contact he was seeking, who asked the right thing from the right direction, and answered it with a method that split him across two realities and left him whole in neither. Willem, who saw everything, predicted everything, tried to prevent everything, and sat in a rocking chair at the edge of a lake for decades, inserting eyes into his own skull, watching the catastrophe he foresaw proceed on schedule. The player character, who came to Yharnam seeking something they couldn't name and spent one impossible night accumulating enough insight, enough umbilical cord, enough compressed experience of everything the hunt could throw at them to become something the moon presence could not claim, These stories don't resolve cleanly. There is no version of Bloodborne where the questions at the bottom of all of this, what pale blood really is, whether the player was always what the true ending reveals, whether Gehrman's imprisonment was cruelty or mercy, whether Micolash was mad or visionary or both, come to a neat conclusion and release you into certainty. That is the design. The unresolved questions are not a flaw to be corrected. They are the point. Because Bloodborne is a game about what happens at the edge of what can be known. And the feeling you get sitting at that edge, the feeling that there is something just beyond your current capacity to understand, something that has a shape and a logic but that you cannot quite hold fully in your mind, is the feeling the game was built to produce. It is not frustration, or not only frustration, it is something closer to wonder. The specific quality of attention that comes when you're in the presence of something genuinely larger than you. The questions don't all resolve. Some of them are designed to stay open, to live in you and continue asking themselves long after the screen is dark and the room is quiet and you're trying to sleep, the way that certain things stay with you. Pale blood, what it is, whether you found it, whether you are always it. Maybe that's the answer the game was always building toward, not a definition, not a revelation delivered in a cutscene, but a feeling. The feeling that you have been changed by the act of looking, that you carry something now that you didn't carry at the beginning, that you see, even just a little, differently. That's what eyes on the inside means. That's what Bloodborne wanted to give you all along. Throughout every chapter of this video, the word insight has appeared and reappeared like a thread running through the weave. It is worth pausing before we fully close to think about what insight actually is in Bloodborne's world, what the game is saying when it makes this measurable, when it represents it as a number that climbs as you encounter more truths, when it shows you its effects through changed visual details and shifted enemy behaviors, and the slow revelation of things that were always there but invisible. Insight, in the most literal sense the game uses, is exposure to the eldritch truth. It is the accumulated result of encounters with things that exist beyond ordinary human perceptual range. Great ones, their kin, the nightmares, the spaces where the boundary between ordinary reality and the nightmare thins. Every time you perceive one of these things directly, something in your cognition shifts. Something opens that was closed. The aperture of your perception widens. At low insight, Yharnam is horrible but legible. It is a city in the grip of a plague, full of transformed people and desperate survivors and hunters who may or may not still be functional. You can understand the situation in those terms. It is terrible, but it makes a kind of sense. At high insight, the world is different, not just in the details, though the details change significantly, enemies behaving differently, new enemies appearing, the messengers multiplying and acquiring strange accessories, but at the quality of experience. The game feels different at high insight, denser, more layered, as though the same information is present but the compression of it has changed, and you are now receiving a less edited version. This is what the Healing Church wanted to give people. This is what Byrgenwerth discovered was possible. This is what every experiment in the research hall, every celestial emissary produced by the choir, every scholar hung in a cage in Yharnam was aimed at achieving by force or by technique. The difference between what those institutions were attempting and what the true ending of the game provides is not one of goal, but of method and of pacing. They tried to produce insight rapidly, through concentrated application of blood, or through forced proximity to divine things, or through the mechanical projection of consciousness into spaces the body wasn't ready to follow. And rapid insight, forced insight, insight that outpaces the person receiving it, that shatters. The true ending comes to a player who has accumulated insight gradually, over the course of one full night of the hunt, who has encountered each truth in its proper sequence, with enough time between encounters to partly integrate what they found before the next truth arrives, who has survived enough, died enough, learned enough, pushed enough at the edges of what their character can endure, to arrive at the umbilical cords with the body and a mind that are, however imperfectly, ready for what 3 chords worth of divine contact represents. This is Willem's philosophy, quietly vindicated, not the rapid distribution Laurence pursued, not the forced modification the choir developed, not the consciousness projection Mensis achieved, the slow accumulation of a hunter who kept going, kept encountering, kept absorbing, and reached the end of the night changed enough to step through. Insight is not just a stat, it is a record of how much of the truth you have been willing to look at. And in Bloodborne, looking at it long enough, steadily enough, without flinching, that is itself the answer to everything. It is easy, in a video about the great cosmic mysteries of Bloodborne, to lose track of the human scale. The fishing hamlet and the research hall and the School of Mensis are extraordinary situations involving extraordinary people pursuing extraordinary ambitions. But Yharnam is also a city full of ordinary people, and their situation is worth thinking about. The citizens who roam the streets on the night of the hunt, those groups armed with torches and pitchforks, those clusters of frightened survivors, those broken figures muttering to themselves in doorways, are people who went to the healing church for blood ministration because they were sick, because it worked, because it healed things that shouldn't heal, and it was available, and the church said it was safe, and there was no particular reason to doubt the church. They didn't know what the blood was. They didn't know it was derived from Great One contact. They didn't know that the researchers who developed it had been warned explicitly, multiple times, by the people most qualified to give that warning, that distributing it at this scale would produce exactly what is happening to Yharnam tonight. They just wanted to be healthy. They got a plague. The tragedy of Yharnam's ordinary people is that they are casualties of an intellectual argument between scholars. Willem told Laurence that the blood would do this. Laurence decided he knew better, and the people who trusted the institution, who had no reason not to, who were simply trying to get through their lives in a cold Victorian city with whatever tools were available, became the evidence that Willem was right. The hunters who move through the city, who cut down the transformed and the bestial and the merely frightened, are doing necessary work in the immediate sense, but the people they are cutting down were once just people. They had names and histories and family members still sheltering in locked houses, listening to the screaming outside. The blood ministry turned them into this. The blood ministry that the church built on a foundation of deliberately ignored warnings. Bloodborne invites you to care about this, not sentimentally, not in a way that makes the game unplayable, but in the texture of what it shows you, the messages the citizens leave, the fear in their voices, the specific human quality of their transformation into something monstrous. They are not abstractions, They are people who trusted an institution that betrayed them, and they are paying for that betrayal with their bodies and their minds. This is what makes the Healing Church genuinely villainous rather than merely mistaken. Not the ambition to connect with the Great Ones, to expand human perception, to heal the sick and elevate the capable. These are not contemptible goals. But the willingness to use ordinary people as the medium of that ambition without their meaningful consent, and to proceed even when the warnings were clear and the person who gave them had been proven right repeatedly. That is the specific moral failure the game returns to over and over. The citizens of Yharnam are what happens when the powerful decide that their vision justifies the cost, and the cost is paid by people who had no say in the vision. No analysis of Bloodborne's mysteries would be complete without a word about the messengers. Those small, pale, tentacled figures that are everywhere in the game, carrying items up from the ground when you leave them at lamps, gathering in groups, occasionally wearing hats or flowers that you can dress them in with the right items. They are never explained, their origin is never given, their relationship to the dream and to the Great Ones and to the hunt is implied but not stated. The most widely accepted reading is that the messengers are failed hunters, people who passed through the hunter's dream and were absorbed into it rather than freed, who became something diminished and strange and fundamentally changed by their long residence in the dream space. They have lost the form they had. They have lost the language they spoke. They have retained only the function, the desire to help, to carry, to be useful in the small ways that are available to them. This reading is supported by the fact that their existence is broadly continuous with what the dream does to Gehrman, traps him, changes him, keeps him beyond his natural span in a form shaped by the dream's requirements rather than his own nature. The messengers are Gehrman taken further, people who were in the dream long enough that the dream became all of them. If this is correct, then every time a messenger carries an item up to you from the ground, you are being served by someone who was once a hunter, someone who came through the dream, survived however much of the hunt they survived, and ended up small and pale and helpful at the bottom of a pool of insight. There is something both gentle and heartbreaking about that. Bloodborne fills its world with tragedies large enough to restructure your understanding of a civilization, and then it also fills your feet with tiny pale creatures that just want to be helpful. And somehow, both scales of tragedy are equally present. The messengers are what the dream does to everyone, eventually. Gehrman just got the extended version. 10 years is a long time for a video game mystery to remain alive. Most games' lore discussions peak around launch, and then fade as the community moves on. Bloodborne's have not faded. The same questions that were being argued about in 2015 are still being argued about, still generating new theories, still producing new readings that catch something the previous readings missed. Why? Part of it is the quality of the source material. Bloodborne's lore is exceptionally well constructed, internally consistent, built with visible craft, full of details that reward re-examination. The item descriptions are dense with implication. The environmental storytelling is layered in ways that reveal new information on subsequent playthroughs. The connections between different areas of the game's world, Byrgenwerth and the church and the hamlet and the nightmare and the dream, are precise in ways that feel like they were planned from the beginning rather than assembled as things went on. but quality of construction alone doesn't explain longevity. Plenty of well-constructed lore doesn't sustain a decade of active engagement. What Bloodborne has that many others don't is strategic absence. The game is missing things on purpose, not cutting corners, missing things in the specific, deliberate way of an author who understands that the gaps in a story are as meaningful as what fills them. The absence of an explanation for Paleblood is not an oversight. The silence around the player character's true identity is not laziness. The mystery of what the moon presence actually wants, or what Udon is, or why the doll was given life. These are open by design, and they are open in a specific quality. They feel important. They feel like the answer is just out of reach. They feel like the game knows the answer and has decided, for good reasons, not to tell you. That feeling, the sense that there is an answer and you could almost reach it, is what keeps people coming back. It is why Bloodborne's lore discussions are not arguments about what is correct, but conversations about what is most beautiful. What reading honours the game most fully? What interpretation makes the most of the material that is there? The mysteries endure because Bloodborne made them worth enduring. It made its silences feel sacred rather than empty. It made not knowing feel like a form of knowing, like sitting in a room with something vast, able to feel its presence without seeing its shape, and finding that you don't need to see the shape to be certain that it's real. That is what Bloodborne gives you, if you let it. Not answers. Something better. The sense that the questions were worth asking in the first place. The blood moon is the sky-level symptom of everything that has gone wrong. It appears over Yharnam at a specific point in the game's progression. After Rom, the vacuous spider, is defeated and the veil she maintained is torn away. And once it appears, it does not go away. The sky stays red, the city stays changed, and the implication is that the boundary between the waking world and the nightmare has thinned so much that they are beginning to overlap. This is what Mensis did. The school's ritual, maintaining the nightmare and keeping Murgo present and crying, has been pressing against the veil for long enough that the veil has nearly failed. Rom's maintenance of the separation, her constant, exhausting, mindless sustaining of the boundary that keeps ordinary people from seeing the eldritch truth, is the only thing that has been keeping Yharnam on the correct side of the line. When you defeat Rom, you're not simply advancing through a boss encounter, you are choosing to let the veil fall. You're accepting that the truth being hidden is less dangerous than the continued maintenance of the hiding. This is arguably the game's most significant philosophical moment, dressed in the costume of a boss fight against a spider crab creature that doesn't even attack you unprovoked. The blood moon that follows is what Yharnam looks like when it has nothing left to hide behind. When the dreams and the nightmares and the ordinary streets are all visible simultaneously, when the barriers that kept the different registers of reality separate have been removed, when the city is finally, fully, what it has always been underneath the veneer of functioning society. It is terrifying. It is also, if you let yourself feel it, liberating. There is a specific quality to the post-Rom section of Bloodborne that is different from everything before it. The pretense is gone. The world is exactly what it is, and moving through it requires you to have already decided that you can look at it without breaking, which, if you've gotten this far and accumulated this much insight, you probably have. The blood moon is the world without its veil, and it is also strangely more honest than anything you have encountered before it. We have spent this entire video talking about the institutions and the cosmic forces and the mysteries that operate above and below the hunt, the church that created it, the nightmare that shadows it, the moon presence that sustains it. But the hunt itself deserves a moment. The hunt is, in its bare structure, a nighttime patrol of Yharnam's streets in which hunters kill things that should not be permitted to roam. This is presented as necessary, and it is necessary in the short term, in the specific sense that the transformed and the bestial would cause serious harm to the survivors who have locked themselves in their homes and are listening to the screaming outside. The hunt has a genuine protective function, but the hunt also perpetuates the conditions that make it necessary. The blood ministration continues because the church benefits from it continuing. The transformations continue because the blood is still being administered. The hunters keep hunting because the things that need to be hunted keep being produced. It is a system that sustains itself by never resolving the problem at its root. This is what Gehrman means, in his way, when he talks about the night not ending. The hunt doesn't end because the hunt isn't designed to end. It is designed to continue. Manage catastrophe, sustained indefinitely, providing the moon presence with the ongoing harvest of extreme human experience that it seems to require. Transcending the hunt in this light is not just a personal achievement, it is a refusal to participate in the system, a declaration that you have found a way out that is not the blood-soaked compromise of continuing to hunt until you are either freed by Gehrman's blade or trapped in the dream yourself. The true ending is not just cosmic transformation, it is, in the most practical sense, a strike, an exit from the system, a refusal to keep hunting in a night that was never going to end. There is one more thing worth naming at the end of a video like this one. Something about the specific act of listening to Bloodborne's lore at night in a format designed for rest. Bloodborne is a game about what happens when you look directly at things that are too large for ordinary perception to handle. And there is something fitting about receiving its lore not in the alert, analytical state of someone trying to win an argument, but in the quiet, receptive state of someone lying still in the dark, letting the information settle where it wants to settle, rather than forcing it into structures. The people in Bloodborne who went wrong, Micolash, the choir's volunteers, the research hall's patients, went wrong partly because they were too aggressive about the insight. They pushed toward it. They forced the contact. They tried to extract the meaning rather than waiting for it to arrive at the pace it preferred. The people who fared best, Willem, who accumulated insight slowly and deliberately, the player character, who moved through one full night at whatever pace the night demanded, were the ones who let the experience come to them, who remained present but did not force. Listening to lore videos at night, in the dark, in the particular softness of that state between waking and sleep, this is a form of that patience, letting the information settle, letting the questions rest in the body, rather than demanding that the mind resolve them immediately. Letting Yharnam be the place it is, and letting its mysteries be mysterious, without the urgency of needing to have it all figured out before morning. You will wake up with things slightly rearranged. Connections you didn't consciously make will have been made somewhere in the quiet. Questions that seemed pressing will have relaxed, and some of the things we talked about tonight will still be with you, not as unresolved problems but as interesting presences, like rooms in a house you know well, that you return to because the quality of the light in them is worth returning to. That is what lore like Bloodborne's is for at its best. Not to be solved, to be lived with. We touched on Eden briefly in Micolash's chapter, but this entity deserves its own consideration. Because of all the great ones in Bloodborne, Eden is the one whose nature most directly illuminates what the game is asking about consciousness and transcendence. Eden is formless. There is no physical body. There is no shell, no creature, no material presence. Where the other great ones have forms, vast, strange, biological forms that exceed ordinary frames of reference, but forms nonetheless, Eden simply does not. Eden exists as pure cognition, or something we can only inadequately describe as pure cognition, a presence with no physical anchor, a mind with no body. This should, in theory, be the ultimate achievement of everything that Byrgenwerth and the Healing Church were working toward. The apotheosis of the Insight Project, the state where the cognitive has been fully liberated from the biological, where the limitations of flesh, the slowness and fragility and eventual decay of the physical have been transcended entirely. And yet Eden is not the most powerful or most revered of the great ones in the game's world. Eden is, in a sense, incomplete. Without form, the entity cannot act in the physical world except through proxy. Without biological presence, there is no way to reproduce, to create physical connection, to leave the material remnants that the umbilical cords represent. Eden collects the echoes of blood and consciousness, worshipped by those who seek a formless transcendence. But the formlessness itself is as much limitation as liberation. The true ending's infant great one, the form you take after consuming the cords and resisting the moon presence, is something neither fully physical nor fully cognitive, a new entity, something that has the Great One's cognitive reach and the human's capacity for embodied experience simultaneously. This may be, in the game's cosmological terms, actually more advanced than Eden's pure formlessness, not a step toward what Eden is, but a step towards something that does not yet have a name. Micolash invoked Eden as the model for what he was reaching toward. He wanted to become formless, to abandon the body entirely in pursuit of pure cognition. But the true ending suggests that the body is not the obstacle. The integration of body and expanded consciousness is what the Great Ones are actually looking for in their human surrogates. Not pure mind, but mind and matter together in a new configuration. Eden is not the answer. Eden is one of the questions. In the midst of all the scholars and hunters and ancient architects of catastrophe, there is Ariana, a woman of pleasure, as the game politely describes her, who shelters in the cathedral ward during the night's events and who, if you guide her to safety and fulfill certain conditions, gives birth on the night of the blood moon to a child that is not entirely human. Ariana has old blood, not in the institutional sense, not the church's old blood, administered through blood ministration. Old blood in the hereditary sense. Something in her lineage connected to the Cainhurst bloodline or to the Thumerian ancestry that persists in certain families in Yharnam's history. The blood she carries is different from ordinary citizens' blood in ways she probably doesn't fully understand. And on the night of the blood moon, with the veil down and the boundary between ordinary reality and the nightmare at its thinnest, that old blood responds. A great one reaches through. The contact produces a child, small, multi-limbed, clearly not ordinary, that she delivers in the sewers beneath Yharnam while the hunt continues above. Ariana's story is small relative to the cosmic scale of everything else in the game, but it is one of the most precise illustrations of Bloodborne's central theme, that divine contact does not happen only to the prepared and the ambitious. The Great One's reaching is not limited to the institutionally sanctioned pathways of the Healing Church or the deliberate rituals of the School of Mensis. It can happen to anyone with the right blood in the right conditions on the right night. Ariana didn't ask for a connection to the divine. She was simply present, with the blood she was born with on the night when the boundary was thinnest, and the contact found her. This is simultaneously beautiful and terrible. Beautiful because it suggests that the divine is more available, more genuinely accessible than the Church with its monopoly on blood ministration would want anyone to believe. Terrible because it suggests that availability is not the same as safety, that the contact can arrive without preparation, without support, without any of the scaffolding that Byrgenwerth and the Acquire spent decades trying to build. Ariana's child is not a horror, it is a wonder, a new thing made from the contact between what she carried and what reached through to find her. But her condition afterward, curled in the sewers, exhausted, barely conscious, holding something that is not quite what she expected to hold, is a reminder that being the vessel for the divine does not protect you from the cost of it. She's one of Bloodborne's many people who are caught in the crossfire of things larger than themselves, and her specific version of that experience, the unexpected, unrequested, intensely personal version of the contact that the institution spent their entire existence trying to manufacture deliberately, as one of the game's quietest tragedies. The divine found her, she survived it, and the child she delivered is somewhere in the sewers now, small and strange and new, while the city above destroys itself in pursuit of exactly what she stumbled into without looking. The night that Bloodborne takes place in is not an ordinary night. It is not simply the dark hours before dawn. The hunt night is a suspended condition, a state the city of Yharnam has been entering periodically for long enough that it has its own rituals, its own protocols, its own professionals. People know what to do when the night begins. They lock their doors, they shutter their windows, they wait. The hunters go out. There is something deeply human about the way Yharnam has organised itself around a catastrophe it cannot end. The blood ministry continues because the Church benefits from it. The transformations continue because the blood is still administered. The hunt happens because the transformations keep coming. And the city has found a way to live inside this cycle, not comfortably, not without grief, but with the kind of accommodation that people make when the alternative is refusing to function at all. What the true ending reveals is that the night can end. Not just for one hunter, not just for Gehrman, but as a condition. The moon presence, which sustains the hunt and the dream, can be resisted by someone who has accumulated enough of the right substance. The cycle, which has seemed eternal, has a point of failure. That point of failure is you, and you reach it not through rage or through cleverness or through some secret technique discovered in a hidden area. You reach it by playing the game fully, by looking at everything, by engaging with every mystery and every tragedy and every question that the night puts in front of you, by accumulating insight, literal and metaphorical, until you are the kind of person or the kind of thing that can stand in the presence of a moon presence and refuse. The night ends when someone decides finally and completely that they have seen enough to see through it. You are that someone. Sleep well, Hunter.